How dangerous is it to visit Kyiv during the war? I visited Kyiv twice before the war and was due to be there a third time the weekend of the invasion, and only canceled my plans when the British embassy said that they weren't going to help repatriate citizens. Although during the second week of the war, a friend from Kyiv did invite me to visit and said that he could organize a lift for me from Poland, and I was seriously tempted to go, but eventually decided that I'd probably be more of a burden than a help, and so decided against it. But I continued to want to come back to the country to see my friends and just to see what Kyiv felt like during wartime. In September 2022, Putin said that he was going to annex 4 regions in eastern Ukraine, and I realized that things were escalating and that my window of opportunity to visit comparatively safely was closing. So I looked into a trip and tried to calculate my risk levels. The British Foreign and Commonwealth Office have a website that lists the risk levels of various countries in the world, and they have maps which are color-coded. So you have green for safe, orange for risky, and then red for dangerous. And I thought Ukraine would be mostly orange with some red parts in the conflict zones. But I looked it up, and Ukraine was just one big red blob. In fact, the FCO website said that they advised against all unofficial and official travel to Ukraine. But then I thought, yeah, okay, but I'd been to Colombia that summer, and a friend of mine from Bogota advised me that you should not walk around, even in posh neighborhoods, after 7 p.m. because guys with machetes on motorbikes will chase you, because this had happened to him multiple times in Bogota. And I thought, okay, well, I'd survived Colombia. Let's look that up on the FCO website and see how dangerous that is. And I was expecting Colombia to be mostly orange with some red bits, but in fact, every single place I'd been to in Colombia was green. So apparently visiting Ukraine was much, much more dangerous than being chased by guys with machetes on motorbikes. In fact, visiting Ukraine was so dangerous, even my insane friend Andrei, a Ukrainian living in London, advised me against doing it. And this is the guy that encouraged me to ride on the back of his friend Ilya's motorbike at 250 kilometers per hour in Kyiv traffic, and who then encouraged me to climb up a skyscraper with his friend Mustang Wanted, the urban climber. And he thought this was a bad idea. This was the first time he'd advised me against doing anything. I thought I should check with friends who were actually in Ukraine, so I had a text exchange with a friend in Kyiv who said things like, well, Putin might drop a nuclear bomb somewhere in Ukraine, but he definitely won't drop it on Kyiv because it would be suicidal. And then Lviv looks quite safe, but Lviv is actually close to Ukraine's largest army base, so it's not as safe as it looks. And then eventually he said, look, it's quite hard to calculate risk levels exactly, and ultimately, whether I go to Kyiv or not is more down to how much of a pussy I am. So obviously I had to go. Now, before I continue, I have to explain that I have friends who are fighting on the front line in Ukraine, and visiting Kyiv is quite literally a walk in the park compared to that. I was not in danger of being remotely close to any actual combat, and I didn't think Putin was going to drop a nuclear bomb on the capital city. The risk at the time I visited was that Putin would drop a nuclear bomb somewhere else in Ukraine, and I could be caught up in the radiation cloud. And radiation gives you very serious long-term health consequences. So I remember one evening in a restaurant in Poland, having dinner while I was Googling how to treat radiation sickness, which was fun. Ukrainian airspace is closed, so if you want to go to Kyiv, you have to go by train or by car. And the route I was planning was to fly from London to Rzeszów in Poland, to get a train from Rzeszów to Przemyśl, which is in Poland but on the border with Ukraine, to get a train from Przemyśl to Lviv in western Ukraine, spend a few hours in Lviv, get some lunch there, and then get the overnight train from Lviv to Kyiv, which all in all is a 2-day trip. And the way I took myself into it was to say, I'll just do it a step at a time. So initially I thought, okay, I'll just book the tickets, I don't have to use them. Then I thought, okay, I'll just fly to Poland, I don't have to get the train to Lviv. Then it was, okay, I'll get the train to Lviv, I don't have to get the overnight train to Kyiv if I don't want to. And then I thought, okay, I'll just get the overnight train to Kyiv, I can always leave if I change my mind. And before I knew it, I was waking up in the dead center of Ukraine. The way I describe it emotionally is that it was like holding my breath and going underwater. I knew I could only be there a certain amount of time. And I'd wake up in Kyiv and it would take me a few moments to remember where I was, and this sense of dread would sink in when I realized that I'd chosen to be in the one place in the world that was in danger of being nuked at that moment in time. But then I would start my day and it was an amazing trip. I loved seeing my friends, and I filmed a couple of incredible interviews that you can see elsewhere on this channel. There were a couple of times on the trip that were quite hairy. The first was when I first arrived in Lviv and got in a taxi and asked the guy to take me to this Galician restaurant in the center of town. And about 15 or 20 minutes later, I realized he was driving straight out of the city past a military checkpoint with no explanation. And I didn't know if he was kidnapping me or what was going on. It turned out he was just an idiot and he was taking me to the wrong Galician restaurant even though I'd given him the address, so that wasn't really anything. The second scary time was on my second evening in Kyiv when I was at a military dinner. And there was a friend of a friend there who I didn't know super well. We'd been to a music festival together the previous year. We had Fatboy Slim together at Atlas Weekend, which was great, but I don't speak Ukrainian and he speaks very little English, so I didn't get to know him super well, but he was super friendly when I saw him the last time. But this time at the dinner, he was looking at me with what looked like contempt. He was just staring at me repeatedly, sort of shaking his head and muttering something under his breath. And a mutual friend told me that he was just saying over and over again, he's crazy, he's crazy. So then I realized if someone based in Kyiv thought I was insane to be visiting Kyiv at the largest escalation since the start of the war, maybe I was making a mistake. So that evening, I went home and read Putin's entire speech that he gave that weekend when annexing those regions in eastern Ukraine, and tried to gauge whether I thought he was going to nuke Ukraine while I was there. And after reading the whole speech, I calculated that he might nuke Ukraine at some point, but he wasn't going to do it before Wednesday, so I decided to stay. And in fact, I ended up extending my trip by 1 day. 5 days after I got back to London, I woke up to find a bunch of messages from friends asking if I was still in Kyiv and asking if I was okay, so I knew that something bad had happened. I checked the news and saw that there'd been a huge missile strike on Ukraine overnight and that central Kyiv had been hit for the first time since the start of the war. So then I got on the Ukrainian Telegram channels to find out where the missiles had struck, and I saw one video that featured a tree-lined avenue that's very distinctive and that looked exactly like a tree-lined avenue right next to my Airbnb. They hadn't released the locations of the missile strikes, but I recognized this yellow building in the video, looked it up, and calculated that the missile had indeed landed exactly on the crossroads that I would cross every day to get to one of my favorite coffee shops in Kyiv. So I texted the owner of the Airbnb asking if she was okay, and she said she was fine, but her neighbor's windows had been blown in. Another missile landed on the glass bridge, or just next to it, which I'd been standing on and photographed just 5 days before. So unfortunately, my calculation that things were escalating was accurate. So then when I reassured my friends that I was okay and I was no longer in Kyiv, they asked if my friends in Kyiv were fine, which was nice of them, but I thought it was strange that they never asked me how my friends were who'd been fighting on the front line. Because your chance of getting killed in a missile strike in Kyiv are maybe 1 in 100,000, while your chances of getting killed on the front line are a lot higher. If you like this video, like and share so that other people can discover it, and subscribe and turn on notifications so that you can see new releases when they come out. And if you'd like to pay for my travel into a war zone, support Operation Tiggy on Patreon. I'm also hiring a local team, so this creates employment in a country that's had its economy badly hit by the war.